The river is called the Jabbok, and it is the middle of the night. A man stands alone at the water's edge. He has sent his wives ahead. He has sent his children ahead. He has sent everything he owns across that river, in the dark, because tomorrow he will face the brother he robbed of an inheritance 20 years ago, and he does not know if that brother is coming with an army or an embrace. And then, out of nowhere, someone grabs him. You would expect him to run. You would expect him to beg. Instead, this man, this liar, this trickster, this fugitive who has spent his whole life running from consequences, plants his feet in the mud and fights back. All night long. No words. No explanation. Just two bodies straining against each other in the dark, hour after hour, until the sky starts to turn gray at the edges and the stranger tries to walk away. And the man will not let go, even after his hip is wrenched out of its socket, even after the pain should have dropped him to the ground. He wraps his arms tighter around a being he cannot even see clearly and says the only thing that makes any sense at 3 in the morning after a fight like that. I will not let you go unless you bless me. Stay with me. We will get back to him. He is not the only one who ever did this. Because here is what almost nobody expects when they open this book for the first time. This is not a story about blind obedience. This is not a story about people who folded the moment God raised his voice. This is not a story about silence and nodding and never asking why. This is a story about the ones who argued with God, who stood their ground, who refused to back down even when the ground itself seemed to be shaking, and won. Not by defeating God, nobody defeats God, but by being met, answered, taken seriously, changed, yes, sometimes limping for the rest of their lives, but never destroyed. You are going to meet 5 of them tonight. A nomad bargaining in the middle of a road for the lives of strangers. A shepherd standing between an angry God and a nation that just melted its jewelry into a golden calf. A mother who would not stop shouting even when she was told, more than once, to be quiet. A man who lost everything demanding an answer from the sky. And the man at the river, whose fight is not over yet. Long before the man at the river was even born, there was another man who argued with God in the middle of a road. His name was Abraham, and by this point in his life he was old enough that most people would have stopped believing anything would change. God had already promised him more descendants than stars. God had already made him wealthy, respected, a man other kings sought out for alliances. The Jewish historian Josephus later described him as a person of remarkable character, someone who reasoned his way through life rather than simply obeying it. And reason is exactly what he does next. You can feel the whole scene lean forward. God tells him, plainly, that the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah are about to be destroyed. And instead of nodding and walking away, Abraham does something almost nobody expects. He stands in the road, and he starts negotiating. What if there are 50 righteous people in the city? Will you destroy the righteous with the wicked? God says no. If there are 50, he will spare the whole city for their sake. And Abraham does not stop there. What about 45? What about 40? What about 30? What about 20? Here's what most people miss when they read this. Abraham is not throwing a tantrum. There is a Hebrew word for a formal dispute brought before a judge, riv, a courtroom word, a legal word, used later for the arguments prophets bring against God himself. Abraham is not begging. He is making a case. He believes the judge of all the earth will do right, and he says so, out loud, to God's face. What about 10? And God says yes. For the sake of 10, he will not destroy it. You already sense where this is going. 10 could not be found. But notice what did not happen. Fire did not fall on Abraham for asking. Lightning did not silence him mid-sentence. The friend of God, as Scripture calls him, walked away from that conversation still standing, still blessed, still trusted with the next promise. But it gets stranger. Picture standing at the base of that mountain yourself. Moses had been gone 40 days. 40 days up on that mountain, receiving instructions for a nation he loved more than his own comfort. And while he was gone, that nation melted down its jewelry and shaped it into a golden calf and bowed down to it. God tells Moses to step aside. "Let me alone," he says, "so my anger may burn against them, and I may destroy them, and I will make of you a great nation instead." Think about what that offer actually costs him. That is not a small offer. That is God offering Moses everything Abraham was promised for himself alone. All Moses has to do is stay quiet. He does not stay quiet. He reminds God of his own promises. He reminds him of the Egyptians watching, waiting to say that God only brought this people into the desert to slaughter them. He asks God to turn from his fierce anger and relent of the disaster he had spoken against his own people. And God relents. Read that again. The text says God changed his mind because a shepherd stood in the gap and refused to move. Here's the part nobody tells you. Moses did not win by threatening God. He did not win by claiming rights he did not have. He won by reminding God who God said he was, and trusting that God would be faithful to his own character. That is not rebellion. That is the deepest kind of faith there is. Now watch what happens next, because the next person who argues with God is not a patriarch, and she is not a prophet. She is a woman nobody would have expected to get near him at all. She is a Canaanite, which means she is not part of the covenant, not part of the promises made to Abraham, not part of the nation Moses fought for. As far as the law was concerned, she had no claim on the God of Israel whatsoever. You can imagine what that kind of desperation does to a mother. Her daughter was tormented, and she had heard that a Jewish rabbi was passing through her region, and she came out shouting after him, "Have mercy on me, Lord, Son of David. My daughter is severely oppressed." He did not answer her, not a word. His own followers asked him to send her away because she kept crying out after them. The Greek word there is akrazen, and the tense of that word means she did not say it once and go quiet. She kept shouting it, over and over, refusing silence. When Jesus finally speaks to her, his words sound like a closed door. He says he was sent only to the lost sheep of Israel. It is not right, he says, to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs. You would have stopped there. Most people would have stopped there. She does not stop. Even that, "Lord," she says. Even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from their master's table. And Jesus looks at her and says something he says to almost no one else in the entire Gospels. "Woman, great is your faith." Her daughter was healed in that hour. You have to sit with that for a second. She was outside the covenant. She had every reason to expect silence, or rejection, or worse. And instead, her refusal to stop arguing became the very proof of the faith Jesus praised above almost anyone else he met. So notice the pattern forming here, because it is easy to miss if you are only half paying attention. An old nomad negotiated the fate of 2 cities, and he was not struck down. A shepherd talked God out of destroying a nation, and he was not struck down. A woman with no covenant claim at all kept shouting until she got an answer, and she was not struck down. Every single time, the person who argued was not punished for arguing. They were met, heard, sometimes even praised. If that pattern is new to you, if you always thought pushing back on God was the one thing you were never allowed to do, hit subscribe now, because there are 2 more people coming, and they take this further than you think. Now go back to the river. You remember him, the man alone in the dark, everyone he loves already sent across the water, fighting something he cannot see and will not name. Here's what the text does not tell you outright, but what you can feel if you sit with it. This is not a brief scuffle. This is all night, hour after hour, in mud, in darkness, in silence except for breathing and strain. No one is shouting demands. No one is negotiating cities or nations. This is just a man refusing to stop. You can almost feel it yourself. And somewhere near dawn, the stranger does something strange. He touches the man's hip, and it is wrenched out of its socket, and the pain must have been unbearable, the kind of pain that ends fights, that drops grown men to their knees. And still he does not let go. "Let me go," the stranger says, "for the day is breaking." "I will not let you go," the man answers, "unless you bless me." Pay attention to this, because it matters. The stranger asks his name. "Jacob," he says, a name that literally means he grasps the heel. A name given to him at birth because he came out of the womb holding on to his twin brother's foot. He has spent his whole life grasping his brother's birthright, grasping his brother's blessing, grasping and running and lying to get what he could not receive honestly. And the stranger tells him his name will not be Jacob anymore. It will be Israel. In the Hebrew, the word carries the root sarita. You have striven. You have wrestled. Not you have obeyed. Not you have submitted. You have striven with God and with men, and you have overcome. He walks away from that river limping for the rest of his life. But he walks away blessed. He walks away renamed. He walks away, changed but not destroyed, carrying, in his own body, the proof that the fight actually happened. Hold that thought, because there is one more person you need to meet, and his fight lasted a lot longer than one night. His name is Job, and by the time we meet him, he has lost everything a man can lose in this life. His children, his wealth, his health, his reputation. His friends sit with him for 7 days without saying a word, which turns out to be the wisest thing any of them do. And then they start talking, and every one of them tells him the same thing. You must have done something to deserve this. You would want an answer too. Job knows he did not. And so, for chapter after chapter, he does something that makes a lot of readers uncomfortable. He does not quietly accept his suffering as a mystery he has no right to question. He builds a case. He uses that same courtroom word we heard with Abraham, a riv, a formal legal complaint, and he says, in essence, I want to bring this before God myself. I want an answer. Oh, that I knew where I might find him, Job says, that I might come even to his seat. I would present my case before him and fill my mouth with arguments. There's one more thing worth noticing here. Nobody strikes Job dead for saying that. His friends condemn him for it. God does not. So Job gets his wish. After chapter of complaint, after friends who kept insisting his suffering must be punishment, after Job himself demanding a courtroom and a verdict, God actually shows up. Not gently, out of a whirlwind. You would not have been ready for that either. And here is where it gets remarkable, because you would expect God to open with an answer, an explanation, a reason for the suffering. Instead, he opens with a question. Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Have you commanded the morning since your days began? Job is asked question after question about the width of the universe and the birthplace of light and the storehouses of snow, and he is never once told why his children died. And Job's response is not what you would expect either. He does not apologize for asking. He does not take back a single word of his complaint. He simply says, I had heard of you by the hearing of the ear, but now my eye sees you. He goes quiet, not the quiet of a man who has been crushed, but the quiet of a man who has finally been in the room. And then something happens that should stop you cold if you have never noticed it before. God turns to Job's friends, the ones who spent 30 chapters defending him, insisting Job must have sinned, never once raising their voice at heaven. And God says his anger burns against them. Because, he says, you have not spoken of me what is right, as my servant Job has. Read that twice. The friends who never argued were wrong. The man who argued for 30 chapters was right. This is not a story about a man who suffered quietly and was rewarded for his patience. This is not a story about friends who kept the peace and were praised for their caution. This is not a story about staying silent in front of God being the safer, holier choice. This is a story about a man who brought his case out loud and was told he had spoken rightly. Now go back one more time to the river. To Jacob, in the mud, his hip out of its socket, refusing to let go until dawn. He is not a footnote. He is the pattern. Abraham argued in a road and was still called God's friend. Moses argued at a mountain and God relented. A woman with no covenant argued in the street and was praised above almost anyone else Jesus met. Job argued for 30 chapters and was told he alone had spoken rightly. And Jacob wrestled all night, wounded, exhausted, and would not stop, and walked away limping, renamed, blessed. Every single one of them was changed by the fight. Not one of them was destroyed by it. You may already know what that river feels like. Maybe it was not an angel and a hip socket. Maybe it was a hospital corridor at 3 in the morning, fluorescent lights humming, a chart you were not allowed to read, and a prayer that did not sound like a prayer so much as an argument. Why? Why this? Why now? Maybe you have stood in that corridor and wondered if the arguing itself was the sin, if a good and quiet faith would have simply accepted it without a fight. It was not the sin. For Abraham, for Moses, for a woman with no covenant, for Job, for a man limping away from a river at sunrise, it was never the sin. So here is what this leaves you with. First, the truth. Scripture never once shows honest arguing with God being met with destruction. Abraham argued and kept his name as God's friend. Moses argued and God relented. A woman with no covenant claim argued and was praised. Job argued for 30 chapters and was told he alone had spoken rightly. Jacob wrestled all night and walked away renamed. Second, what that means for you. If you have ever sat in silence because you were afraid your questions were too big or too angry or too honest for God to handle, you are not protecting your faith by staying quiet. You may have been avoiding the very thing faith is for. And third, the one that should sit with you longest. Every person in this video who argued with God walked away marked by it. Jacob limped for the rest of his life. Job never got his questions fully answered. He got something else instead. None of them left unchanged, but none of them left alone. So tell me, out of everyone in this video, whose argument with God hit closest to something you have carried yourself? Abraham's bargaining, Moses standing in the gap, the woman who would not stop shouting, Job's 30 chapters of complaint, or Jacob, in the mud, at the river, refusing to let go? Tell me below, because the God who let all 5 of them argue is still, apparently, willing to be found by anyone desperate enough to keep asking.